Well, welcome again to the second part of our conversation. But this time I want to talk about your museum work at the National Museum of Scotland. You left Kent University and then you started living and working in Edinburgh, which is a special place in my heart, Edinburgh City, and the university, and the National Library. But I want to ask you how, because you worked at the Royal Observatory as well, so you weren't necessarily a complete stranger to museum displays. But how is it working as a historian of science at a museum where everything is you are interested is on display like that?
It's great. I mean, it's very nice to work at somewhere like National Museum of Scotland because it is a multidisciplinary museum in a way that, say, the Science Museum in London is focused on science and technology. The Maritime Museum, you know, has a lot of social history around its maritime stories, but it has a very particular focus. But NMS in Edinburgh really covers a lot of disciplines. It's got material from all over the world. It's got natural science collections, so there's geologists, paleontologists, I can't say that word.
Paleontologists?
That's the one.
Yeah.
And specialists in invertebrates. So, you know, you have that side of things. You have a lot of Scottish history collections, came from the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland. You know, they have fashion history, they have furniture history, everything you want. So I really like to be in that context. You're not sort of siloed as a historian of science or working to speak to people who only are interested in science, but they may be interested in all sorts of things. You still get those silos within a big institution, of course, and sometimes people, you know, even your own sort of educators within the museum may not really understand what we do and who we like to have conversations with and so on. So that's, you know, something I'm still learning. I've been there some years now, but it still feels quite early days.
Yeah.
So
how long has it been though?
I started in 2020,
okay.
But we started working from home because it was still pandemic. So it took quite a long time to get to working back in the museum. But yeah, I have great colleagues, you know, so there are other historians of science that I'm working with, and we're close to the university as well. So there are also, you know, seminars and exchanges we can have there. So it's a very nice situation to be in.
Yeah. You actually have some sort of a tie with HBS there, I think. Have you?
There's the STIS, so Science, Technology, Innovation Studies.
Cambridge,
used to be the Science Studies unit at the Edinburgh School in History of Science. Was very important in the past. It's a different sort of place now.
It is now, John Henry's
retired. Yes,
retired. So it's a kind of public engagement, isn't it? Also, the presenting historical objects within a context to the public.
Yes.
And what are the challenges of, you know, doing that?
Lots, I think. I think particularly scientific instruments, when we talked a bit before about the grey boxes and so on, but I think even when they're attractive to look at, I think for an ordinary member of the public, you have to understand something about the historical context and something about, or feel that you need to understand the scientific purpose or discovery or whatever it is that you think a scientific instrument is representing. And those two things might be quite foreign, and to have both of them, you know, as an explanation or as something that you feel you're lacking, I think can make it quite difficult to look at these things. I think they do quite a good job at the museum, which is so before my time, they had already redone the whole building and you know, reopened and redid all the galleries. And in general, they have things on the ground floor that are very accessible for children, lots of hands-on and space to move around. And then the interpretation gets a bit deeper. The objects get a bit more complicated as you go up the building. So we have all those different disciplines have sort of separate stacks within the main part of the museum. And science and technology, you know, it comes to things like particle physics on the third floor, or optics and so on. And I think they're done in an accessible way, but it's people who are very interested will get there and see these objects. The real experts always want to see more. They always say, why have you not got every microscope you have on display. Well, of course we can't. They're mostly in store.
Yeah.
The general public doesn't want to see that many. And they always say, why don't you say this in the label? And the answer is, well, because we only have, maybe 40 words that we're allowed to put in a label.
Yeah.
Because people in general don't read very much in museums. They walk through, they get an impression. But some people want more, and we have some good interactives where you can press buttons and find out more if that's what people want. But I think it's always a challenge to get the balance right.
Yes.
The real experts will never be happy with what you do.
Exactly.
And most people will walk past and not engage very much. So you hope you're catching the people who just see something and want to know a bit more, then they'll move on. We also have the Museum of Scotland.
You do, yes.
So that's the newest part of the building, 20th century rather than the 19th century building. And that tells a chronological story about Scotland if you work up the building. And what I quite like as a historian, what's quite nice is that the scientific instruments there are not telling you so much about science, but they're telling you about Scotland and its connections with the world. So there the instruments are talking about, say, navigation. So this is how Scottish people were part of creating empire, or were trading with other people around the world, or were discovering, went out. We've got David Livingstone and David Ray and various people who, are going to different parts of the world, and there are instruments to help tell that story about mapping and surveying and navigation and so on. And medicine, that story is told as it changes through time and so on. So for me as a historian, having all those different kinds of collections mixed up to tell a story about a place is more satisfying, I think, and I hope it's more approachable for general visitors to see an instrument in that context than to feel, now I've got my science hat on as I work through this.
Okay, a bit of a kind of a controversial question for you. When you say, when you talk about museums and like having the National Museum part, historical part, talking about kind of incorporating the national with the scientific aspects, it is a nation-building exercise, isn't it? And also, I always felt British Museum. First time when I went, it's my personal experience. Obviously, you don't have to agree with it. I thought it was a big imperial project, kind of the big empire where sun doesn't set, and where sun doesn't set, we're going to bring artifacts to show that we are an all-encompassing empire. But it's different with Scotland. So, kind of, do you think it's a nation-building exercise?
In part. I mean, I think it's made by lots of different curators. I mean, it was, so that's the end of the 20th century. It's now 25 years old or something, or 20 years old, the display's there. So it's already a history. We can start to tell its own history about how people were seeing Scotland and what they were prepared to talk about then. And I think we've moved on. I think Scotland itself has changed. I think something that's quite interesting is the shift from thinking about Scotland as, an oppressed part of an English empire into realising, I mean, we've known this for a long time, but in terms of the sort of public understanding and presentation, really acknowledging how much Scotland was part of creating the British Empire. And we know that Scottish place names are all over the world because Scottish people were going out to create empire through military, through the navy, through science, as well as part of that story. So that is in that museum as it stands. But I think we would now want to be more understanding of the exchanges. It's not just these people went out, these people brought back. It's much more about having an understanding of the interactions, which again, I think our colleagues, we have colleagues who are experts on all different parts of the world. So what was our World Cultures Department, who, are along working from the perspective of those other parts of the world. They will have done their PhD research there. So, it's been a process. I think museums were ahead of that conversation that became very big in 2020 with Black Lives Matter and so on, and this kind of very strong public sense of injustices and who's not being spoken about. And I think museums have had those conversations for 20 years and more. Already.
Yes.
But we are now needing to respond to public expectation of having that spelt out much more clearly. And it's interesting also how much, even for us, the way we see things has changed quite recently. And an example in the museum in Edinburgh is the first project we did when I arrived, and this is coming out of 2020, was rework the sort of introductory gallery, which had been called Discoveries. So it was very much this idea of Scottish men, and there were these pictures
things,
up.
yes.
You know, they had sort of light boxes, images of men with beards.
Yes.
And, you know, this was only went in sort of, you know, 2010s. It's not that old.
Okay.
But that idea, you know, it was more subtle if you read the labels, but that's the impression you got.
You got, yes.
These men went out, they discovered, they brought it here.
Yeah.
And of course, we're now in this context of thinking about, you know, should some of those things go back to their countries of origin? How were they taken? What was, again, we had academic projects already working on that sort of question. You know, what is loot? What is the nature? What are the different ways these objects come? But suddenly it became very obvious we had to do something about that. So we've changed it to collecting stories as the nature of it, which sounds a bit nicer. And it's more about the museum process. And the collections are not, you know, it's not all the sort of 19th century origins of the museum itself, but it's a story that keeps on going. And we've, you know, told more stories about women or about immigrant populations who've come to Scotland, or more from the perspective of the people that the encounters are happening rather than just the Scottish discoverer going out. So that gallery has been redone in terms of what's in there, how the objects are interpreted, and just the title, the images. The images are now generally not people, they are objects. So there's not this kind of, you know, Victorian man.
Put the objects to the forefront.
Indeed, yeah.
Okay.
So that's, you know, I think a sign of the times has been interesting.
It is. So the magic word decolonization, does it hit the museum as well? Did you submit any things back to their origin?
Yes. So we have a process that came in place before lockdown. I can't remember when they finalised it, but the possibility of national governments applying to the museum for the return of objects, and that was put in position with a memorial pole. It came from a particular First Nation in Canada, and that they applied to us. They visited it. They then said, this should be back with us. It was an object that the museum had bought in the early 20th century from a dealer working there who was collecting memorial poles, so totem poles, as they're also known, from, you know, this nation, but also others in North America. And he was an anthropologist, so he was an expert, and he was, you know, dealing with the museum. He was buying, he was selling. So in a sense, we could say we own it, it's legitimate, but the feeling now is that it isn't a legitimate purchase. The people, you know, whoever sold it, who may have been from that nation, didn't speak on behalf of their whole community. It's not what the community wanted. They see the pole very much as this kind of living entity, part of they do not recognise it as an object, which was a really interesting part of the discussion.
More than that, isn't it?
It's like, we have this process for our objects, and like, it's not an object. And it's like, okay, how do we begin this conversation and get it right? But they sort of did go through our process in the end. Well, we sort of understood that's not how you're seeing what we're doing, but we have to do this to make it happen. And it has been returned now to Canada, and there is a museum there that it's now on display. So it's been in, you know, the galleries, the Grand Gallery at the museum in Edinburgh for 100 years. And it is no longer there. So it was, you know, part of our history too, because it was with us for a long time. I remember as a child visiting the museum and seeing it there.
Have you?
Yeah. But, you know, it's right that it went back. We've been part of its history, and now it's returned home.
Yeah. Okay, let me just check. How does it feel to create a narrative when you actually present something in a museum? Is it different than the actual writing history of science? I mean, professionally, of course it is different. We talked about that, public engagement and such like. But it's a kind of a narrative, you know, among other things. So, how does it feel to produce that kind of narrative?
It's a very collaborative process, which I think is how it can happen at all. Because if you're a researcher, you're often very close to the subject. There's lots of things you want to get across. And what's always been helpful when I've worked on exhibitions is that you are probably working with other curators, but you're also working with interpretation or education specialists. You're working with designers. You're working with people expert in just mounting objects and all of this sort of thing. So it is a teamwork, and throughout it, as the sort of expert researcher, you are in the first place having to sell your idea of the exhibition to these other people. They always have to understand what you're trying to do. You're also having to sell it internally to the directors of the museum, who will believe that this is something that the public wants to see. So you have to kind of do a sales job on it from the beginning and explain why it's important. Narrative is an interesting question because exhibitions don't have to be narrative.
Curatorial work involves that.
It usually does. A special exhibition, you're probably trying to tell a story. The biggest one I was involved in was the story of longitude at Greenwich, and that absolutely had a chronology to it. We needed to explain, what had been done in the past, why it became a very big deal in the 18th century, what the processes were, what the different competing ideas, how those solutions got rolled out. So there was a chronology to that. In some ways, though, because it's quite a well-known history in a very well-researched area, we came at it, in a sense, not enough from the objects. We did have fantastic objects, but we were fitting objects to the story we wanted to tell, because we were very clear about the story and how that related to the popular idea of it, or what we wanted to get across that was different, what the Greenwich part of that story was. And then we filled it in, we illustrated it with objects in a sense. Although there are some very key objects that were always going to tell that story. The early timekeepers by John Harrison being the most famous of them. But actually, I tried to make them less important in the exhibition than they look normally when they're on display, because they're very striking objects, and we didn't want them to completely dominate because it's only a small part of the story, although it's the main idea of the story for many people and it's what they wanted to see. But I was like, let's put them on one side, try and make them also to understand this part of the story that's, So that was very much narrative. But again, it had to go through this process of working with the exhibition team, with our interpretation officers, making sure everything was understood. Always with, certainly at Greenwich, I've not done a big exhibition yet at Edinburgh, but I'm sure it's a very similar process, is, you need your one line, top line, what is this exhibition about? It's like writing a newspaper story. You've got your top line, your stand first. Pitch, the thing. You've got to make sure that's very clear. And then the same is true for different sections or different rooms in the exhibition, or a different case. What is the purpose of this? And then you can get into the detail as you write your paragraphs or you write your individual labels, but those are always supporting that one big line. So you have to strip out a lot. You can't do it. This is why you'll always annoy the experts, because you can't do everything. There isn't room to do everything. You have to make sure that really, you are clear about the main points that you're trying to get across, and perhaps just let the rest of it go, or you address them in maybe activities that happen alongside the exhibition, or perhaps there will be a audio guide, you can get into some more detail, or whatever, or a book that you publish alongside it. But I think there are other ways of doing exhibitions. I mean, although we might be working with scientific objects, certainly people might try working from a more art perspective, thinking about the objects as artistic objects, looking at them in their own right, or the way, I think something we're often all very interested in is the idea of the object biography around a single object, which might have
like a microhistory.
And it will have many connections, many stories that you might want to tell from one object or a handful of objects. Or you might, and this is getting back to, I think, this question about different voices in the museum, you might want to interpret one object or few objects, not just the curator and the curatorial team's voice, but also, what does a different community think about this object? What's their story? How different is it? So I think that may not be a story or a narrative, but it will be giving us insight into the collections that the museum has.
Yeah. Do you remember my Newton in Scotland project of the digital displays? And so I'm still in the process of talking to my Edinburgh colleagues about it. But while thinking about that, I had crazy, weird and wonderful ideas about incorporating digital world to the museum display. Have you? Does the museum have that kind of initiative?
Yes, but it's hard to do at a sort of on a public engagement level, I think. I've just finished a project which was building a database. Well, there already was a database of scientific instrument makers in Britain and Ireland. We have been remodeling it as a semantic database, so the idea that you could use it to show relational data and information and to link to other data sources as well.
Visualization.
Perhaps visualizations, perhaps texts that have been digitally made available one way or another. And using perhaps the maker as the connecting point or type of instrument or whatever it is, and building this kind of semantic web of connections. But it is such a lot of work to do because none of it happens automatically. You have to create your models, you have to collect, but then also clean the data so that it's meaningful and connected on the right things, so that you unpack, often. So we worked from an existing database that had lots of information in, but it was often stored in slightly different ways. A date would be written one way, one place, slightly different somewhere else, put in a different field. All of that needs to be extracted in order to make it machine readable and meaningful. So I think we're still a very long way from getting that working at a level that will be easily usable by ordinary users and that can be built by ordinary people. Because I think that's the idea again. When I was talking about different voices, it's making it more accessible. Yeah. Different people can come and bring their different idea about it. I think there's a lot of interest in this. In the UK, they've been running a project under the Arts and Humanities Research Council, so one of the major government funding bodies, called Towards a National Collection, that has been funding big projects, lots of money, often mostly connected with museums and collections, and trying to make them meaningful, make them connected. So at the moment we have databases for each individual museum, completely separate. They don't speak to each other. No, it's very hard to say, I know there's an object just like this somewhere else, or at least we might know it as scholars, but you're not doing it in an automated way. You're not making it discoverable for other scholars or ordinary people. So I think we're still a long way away from there. Yeah. In terms of digital things in the museum, I think it is a great way of making things available, whether that's posting on social media or having things interactives within the displays where people can search further, or you can put perhaps a bit of that object story information in there, or geographical connections and that sort of thing.
Or the interactions.
Interactions, absolutely. Or how the thing works, how it moves, all of that. And I think, trying to get all of the work that's produced for gallery work available sort of online or in a connected way would be fantastic and really sort of open things out. But I think it's
still this time.
Still, we need a lot of investment in the skills and the time. And museums at the moment don't have enough funding to do that well.
No. Well, let's hope that for your research and for your museum work, you get a lot of funding and lots of cooperative projects. And I thank you very much for being here and talking to me.
Thank you. No, it's lovely to talk about it.
Thank you, Rebekah.
Thank you, Derya.